How's everyone doing today? Good? Good. Today we are talking about Divine Counsel, Systematic Theology, Part 1. Who are the sons of God and Nephilim in Genesis 6? And most importantly, why does it matter? How many people have even heard teaching on this type of topic? A couple people, good. Well, we'll see if this goes with what you've already learned or if it'll be a completely different turn from that. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. I should mention this is going to be a two-part class. So next week it'll be part 2, and I'll be teaching again. And that's why this is part 1. I just want to mention that right away. Let's start with the text. Oh, and my pointer's not working. Or wait, no, it's off, that's why. There we go. All right, let's start with the text. Can I have somebody read 1 through 5, actually? I only have 1 through 4 up here, but we're going to read 1 through 5. Jacob, go for it.
Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men. They were beautiful. They took wives for themselves, all whom they chose. The Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man's brothers, or yet indeed flesh. This day shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days, also after these. The sons of God came into the daughters of men. They bore children to them, those who were mighty men, who were old, men of renown. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great, that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil.
Thank you for that. I'm going to just jump right to my next slide here. This is a chart of theological triage. How many people were here for Chris's class that he did some months ago about theological triage? Some people were good. If you weren't here, let me just give you a quick overview, which is to say the term theological triage is really meant for if you're choosing a church or if you're thinking about leaving a church, what topics are most important to think about disagreeing on, and which ones are really just not that important for that type of conversation as far as picking a church and that type of thing, or leaving a church. So I would mostly agree with this list. I mean, you could add 100 more things on here if you wanted, but this is just one I took off the internet, to be honest, and I think the simplicity of it is better. So here there's 4 levels, and for example, the first level, salvation, the Bible, the Trinity, Christ. I mean, if you go to a church and they don't have those things right, you shouldn't be going there. That's pretty cut and dry. And as it gets down, it becomes less and less part of the conversation, I think. And as you see, the lowest level here is angels, demons, and the Nephilim, which is honestly what we're going to be talking about today. Now, I actually think it's not the only thing we're going to be talking about today, and I don't think the Nephilim are that important, obviously, but I think they're more important than a lot of people understand. A lot of people only think of Genesis 6, and really they show up elsewhere, and more importantly is the theological implications that they have, which is what we're going to be diving into. So my point of this slide, really, to summarize, is that if you disagree with me on what I'm teaching today, especially about the Nephilim, that's okay. We can talk about it, we can get coffee, or we can just, whatever, but it's really not going to hurt my feelings, and this is an area where it's okay to disagree on, even coming from me, that I'm teaching about this, and it's not something I'm dogmatic about or anything like that. So when we get to Genesis 6, 1 through 4, there are 4 different views. Maybe there's more, and there's probably nuance within these views, but there's at least these 4 different views that come up pretty regularly. And it pretty much, the 4 views are trying to describe who are the sons of God and who are the Nephilim in the verse. So I'll run through them quickly here. The first view is the king view, and it says that the sons of God are kings, and that the Nephilim are people. I'm going to just keep it as simple as that. The second view is the Sethite view, which a lot of people hold to, which says that the sons of God are the lineage of Seth, who were faithful to God, and the Nephilim are the people who were the union of the faithful to God and the unfaithful to God. The supernatural view, which I'm saying is just an alternate title because there's two supernatural views. One of them I don't really have a title for. But anyways, says that the sons of God are fallen angels. And when it goes to that part about the Nephilim, it's saying they're people to contrast the fact that the mythology at the time and various cultures all said that these were spiritual beings, the Nephilim. And so the Bible's correcting them by saying, no, they're not spiritual beings, they're just people. And really, it's a grammatical argument using that text. And then the fourth view is, I'm just going to call it the supernatural view, is saying that the sons of God are fallen angels, and they had children with human wives, and the children were giants. Most people are probably just familiar with the Sethite view and the supernatural view. So, to just get ahead of it here, I'm going to be talking about the supernatural view for the rest of the class. So prepare yourself for that. I'm not really going to talk too much about the other views, but I'm going to be putting positive evidence towards the supernatural view. The first piece of evidence is really all about context. And the next three pieces of evidence are all about context. When we read the Bible, most people here, I think, that I've talked to, would say that context is one of the most important things that we need when reading the Bible. There's context within the Bible, like comparing it to other verses and scriptures, but there's also context outside of the Bible, what the cultures were thinking and doing at that time, and the surrounding cultures, and who they're talking to, and all that kind of thing. And that kind of stuff can be hard to really understand because we have to understand archaeology and ancient languages, and that stuff gets really complicated. But we are going to talk about that. First of all, we're going to talk about Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is older than Israel. Now, our church creed, or statement of faith, or whatever it's called, yeah, one of those things. It talks about how, as a church, we believe the earth is 6,000 years old. I think that's on there, right? Young Earth creation is on there. Don't have to pick a date. And so I'm going to talk about it from that point of view. But before I do, I'm going to mention the point of Mesopotamia that I have the slide on here is they had many, many parallels to Genesis 1 through 11. They have their own creation story. They have a worldwide flood due to gods being angry and people escaping in a boat. They had people before the flood having very long lifespans, and then after the flood, the lifespans get shorter. They had spiritual beings taking human wives and having giant offspring. There's point after point after point of correlation between the Mesopotamian and other Near Eastern cultures with Genesis 1 through 11. Now, and this culture is older than Israel, older than Abraham. As I show here in these numbers here, 1, 2, 3, 4, Mesopotamia is likely, I have a map there, I know it's small, but that brown area is Mesopotamia in the north and east, and that is likely where the Noah's Ark landed, in somewhere in that region, and it's also likely where the Tower of Babel was. We know Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So it's likely his boat landed in that brown area, and people would have settled there. because that's where you are. And he lived 350 years after the flood. For example, Shem lived 500 years after the flood. And Abraham grew up 352 years approximately after the flood, which means that Abraham would have been able to, or at least Abraham's father or grandfather, they all would have been alive. They all came from Noah. Everybody in this whole area came from Noah and Noah's sons. And so the picture I'm trying to paint for you is that Noah and his sons came off the flood. They lived through Genesis 6. They came out of the flood. They would have told their kids, they would have told their grandkids, they would have told their great-grandkids, and so on. People would be spreading out. But Noah living for 350 years, being able to tell people, Shem and his other sons living for hundreds of years after Noah, they would be telling people. So the fact that the Mesopotamian religions had so many points of reference to Genesis 6 puts in context Genesis 6. Now, is it the same story? No, they twisted a lot of things about it. They actually worshipped the spiritual beings that had human wives as gods and people to look up to. And there's a lot of different ways that it got twisted, but it didn't start from new. For example, once we get to Egypt and their religions, which would have started after this, they kind of start from scratch, and they get really weird with what they believe, and it's much more distant from the Bible and what Genesis 6 teaches. Any questions about that? Did I explain that right? Okay, we'll move on. If anybody has any questions, just raise your hand. We'll talk about it. The next context we need to be thinking about is the Septuagint. And the Septuagint was written, for those of you who don't know, I'll just explain what the Septuagint was. The Septuagint was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. Who translated it? The Jewish people, because they were in another land. Greek was becoming a much more major language, and they wanted the Hebrew in the Greek. They wanted the Hebrew Old Testament in the Greek. A lot of people in the New Testament, Jesus included, a lot of the apostles, the books, they quote the Septuagint instead of quoting the Hebrew Old Testament. So it was, Jesus approved, so to speak. I'm not saying it was perfect, but it was very common. And it was translated before the New Testament, which is important because after the New Testament, Jewish people started to change their beliefs because they couldn't, if they're not joining Christianity, they need to be more different from it. But before then, they were doing that. And really, the point of this slide is to show you that the Septuagint translated the word Nephilim to mean giant. There was no alternate translation to that at that time. In fact, I believe, as far as I've been able to tell, the other human views of Genesis 6 really come from, as far as I can tell, 400 years after Christ, or 300 years after Christ, the Augustinian time, from Augustine or from somebody else around that time. So they're pretty far removed from that context. And it comes up later. And I should elaborate on that a little bit more. We might get more theological clarity on systematic ideas as time goes on, as we can study them more. But what I'm talking about for the Nephilim isn't a systematic idea, although I am going to be talking about systematic ideas today. It's just a fact of what does this word mean, and what did the people mean when they were talking about it. And for that, we want to get closer to the source, not further away from the source. The final piece of context that's outside of the Bible that I'm going to bring up today is the book of Enoch. For those of you who don't know, the book of Enoch is a book that was written before the New Testament, probably in that time, probably in that 400-year span where We don't have other biblical writings. There was still people writing books at that time, and that's likely when the Book of Enoch was written. The Book of Enoch's not scripture, not in any way saying that it should be. It's a collection of books, not written by Enoch. I don't think it was written by Enoch. I think it's just called that based off the main character. Why it matters today is because the Book of Enoch was alluded to in the New Testament 50 or 60 times. Not direct quotes, but talking about ideas that show up in the Book of Enoch as if they were common knowledge. It was on the people's minds, the writers' minds. The Book of Enoch is quoted in the Book of Jude more directly. We'll go to that verse later, but it's quoted and it's alluded to throughout the New Testament. What does the Book of Enoch teach that matters for us today? Well, the Book of Enoch teaches that fallen angels took human wives and made giant offspring. And when the giants died, they turned into demons, their spirits did. And that one of the interesting things about the Book of Enoch, actually, that does pertain to us today, is that when the fallen angels came down to earth, they accepted worship and they taught humanity evil things. They taught people things such as sorcery, astrology, how to make drugs, how to make weapons, things like that multiplied evil. And I think that sentence can illuminate verse 5 in Genesis 6 when it says that all that was on people's minds was evil continually. So again, I'm going back to Genesis 6 here, putting it back up on the screen. And what I'm going to be arguing today is who are the sons of God? They're fallen angels. Who are the Nephilim? They're the offspring of the fallen angels. And I can say a couple more things about this verse before we move on. Although I got to move quickly. Where am I here? I have the word "when" underlined. There's a lot of questions with how things happened in this verse that I'm not planning on talking about today. I probably shouldn't bring them up if I'm not planning on talking about them. But they really just don't matter, basically, for the theology of the point. They're questions such as, how did this physically happen? How were the Nephilim on those days before the flood and afterward? One of the explanations for that, I have the word "when" underlined. One translator talked about how the word "when" could really be translated "whenever." So whenever the sons of God came into the daughters of women, they bore children, which would mean after the earth. In a minute here, we're going to get into 2 Peter and the book of Jude, and it talks there about, well, when I get to it, we'll get to it. For now, I wanted to review this verse and move on. Yeah, I'm talking fast. This probably should have been a 4-part series, but here we go. Sons of God in the Old Testament. These are, I believe, all of the verses in the Old Testament that use the word sons of God, or the phrase sons of God. The one exception here is Daniel 3:25, and that uses son of the gods, plural. But I think the idea is really the same. So take that exception for Daniel, although, like I said, I think it fits right in. Job uses it multiple times, clearly as spiritual beings. He uses it in the first chapter about a meeting with God. He used it in the second chapter in the same context. And then later, Job uses it in chapter 38, talking about the foundation of the world, that the sons of God were singing and praising God while the world was being made. So clearly not humans. Daniel 3:25, like I said, it's a slightly different phrase, but talking about when I'm just going to be referencing Bible stories here. I hope you guys are following along. When the people in Daniel were in the furnace, threw into the furnace, the 3 men were thrown in, and it says, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they were not hurt, and the appearance of the fourth is like the son of the gods. Moving on from Daniel, Psalm 82 says, well, we're going to look at Psalm 82 later, but I'm going to be arguing that it's talking about spiritual beings in Psalm 82. Psalm 29 is actually ambiguous, so we can just gloss over and let the other verses dictate what Psalm 29 is talking about. And then Deuteronomy 32, I'm also going to be bringing that one up later, and I think it's clear that that is spiritual beings as well. Let's talk about 2 Peter chapter 2. Does someone want to read this one? Give me a moment to catch my breath. So this is verses 4 through 9. Yeah, go ahead. Yes.
For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. Then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptations and to preserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment.
Thank you. So the part I have highlighted here, the 2 parts I have, it's contrasting the unhighlighted part. So the first highlighted part is talking about the evil that happens, and then the second highlighted part is talking about how God saved the people from the flood. And then it talks about the evil that happens again, and then after that it talks about how God saved Lot. And there's that pattern there. Now, it says in the first sentence, "For if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness." I mentioned how the book of Enoch is alluded to many times. The chains of gloomy darkness, that is an allusion to the book of Enoch. In the book of Enoch, the angels get sent into a pit and bound. It's not the same, it's not a direct quote, but it's an allusion to what happened there. We have to wonder, if not from the book of Enoch or a similar literature, where Peter's getting this information from. Because there's not a verse like this in the Old Testament. And most people don't believe that Peter went into a trance and wrote things and then woke up from it and wondered how the words got on the page. That's not how we think the Bible was written. He had some other knowledge. And now the fact that it's in the New Testament confirms the truth of it. You can see here that angels sinned before the flood. What other story would fit that? If you say it's the Garden of Eden, well, we only know of one angel in that story who sinned, not angels plural. And the angel who sinned in the Garden of Eden isn't chained in gloomy darkness. So if you have a different idea for that, I'd like to know. But I don't think the Garden of Eden story matches up perfectly. I also find it interesting, both in this verse, and we're going to go on, we'll just go right to the next one, and in Jude, it's contrasting these angels with Sodom and Gomorrah, and here in the sexual immorality of Sodom and Gomorrah. Would somebody read Jude 6 through 6 and 7? Kevin.
And the angels who did not save in their own position of authority, but left the proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, served as an example by undergoing all punishment
So I mentioned earlier that there's different questions about how the Nephilim could be on the earth before those days and after those days. So it could be that they weren't cast into the pit immediately upon their sin. They could have been given warnings before the flood and after the flood. Or one group could have been cast into the pit before the flood, and another group could have done the same sin and been cast into the pit after the flood. And there's even other ways to think about it. This verse really mirrors 2 Peter. And again, it's also alluding to the book of Enoch. In verse 14 here, this is quoting the book of Enoch, and I just wanted to put that in there so I had the reference on the screen of when the book of Enoch's quoted. And again, it's comparing it to sexual immorality, unnatural desire, just as the Sodom and Gomorrah. So, let's talk about giants in the Old Testament for a little bit. I'm going to go through this part kind of fast. In the Old Testament, the giant clans were the Anakim, the Rephaim, and occasionally the Amorites. So as you read through the Old Testament in the future, and you see these names, Anakim, Rephaim, and occasionally the Amorites, I want you to be thinking the spiritual offspring of angels. Evil spiritual offspring of angels. They were associated with the hill country, and they were the people who were devoted to destruction. So as we read through the conquest, the crusades, the taking over of the land, it's these groups specifically, when those verses are specific, it's these groups that are devoted to destruction. The term devoted to destruction is a Hebrew word that I'm not going to try to pronounce that's used specifically in these times. The ESV translated it devoted to destruction, but as the conquest starts, a lot of tribes can just be driven out of the land. It uses that a lot. Well, driven out. But sometimes they say, these tribes are devoted to destruction. And I think the theological implication here is that these tribes are spiritually evil. They're the spiritual offsprings of fallen angels, who people worship as gods. And we need to destroy these beings because just their mere presence confirms these gods, that these gods have a presence in the land. It gives people something to fear for these gods. It gives people a reason to worship these gods. And they need to be destroyed. They need to be devoted to destruction. A holy war. I think that point that I'm trying to make is best summarized in Joshua 11:21 through 23. Can I have someone read that for me? Out loud, preferably. Karen.
And Joshua came at that time and put out the Anakims from the hill country, from Hebron, from Zebur, from Ammah, from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction to their feet. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel, only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod, who found me. So Joshua took the land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua did it for an according to Israel, according to the heaven of us. And the land had rest from war.
Okay, so this verse is the summary of Joshua's taking back Israel. And as you can see here, he didn't do a very good job because he left some remained. And later on, David is going to have to fully finish the job and wipe out the rest of these giants. You know, we know of Goliath. Goliath had brothers. There's other ones. But this is how the summary of the conquest is. He's specifically saying, none of the Anakim are left in the land, and so the land had rest. It's not about the other normal humans. Although I'm sure many of them were following the Anakim and got led to destruction during this, but this is a spiritual war. So here I just have some verses about some of the giants. In Deuteronomy 3, really the conquest starts in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. I'm not going to get into that right now, but one of the first people who die is Og of Bashan, who's the king. And they have his bed, or they're talking about his bed, and it was 13 and a half feet in length. Some commentaries mentioned that this might not be a bed, it might be a casket or a sarcophagus. And I am here to tell you, as a funeral director, that that's not helping the story, because caskets are smaller than beds and they're much more fitted to the person. I think you could make an excuse that maybe he just wanted a giant, maybe it was a regular guy who wanted a giant bed. Maybe it was a ritual thing for their religion or something. I don't think those arguments are very strong, but they exist. And the obvious thing is that they're telling you the size of his bed because they're telling you the size of the guy. We also have in the story of David and Goliath, it talks specifically about the size of Goliath. And here there's a difference between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. The Septuagint basically says he's 6'6", and the Masoretic text, which be the Hebrew text, says that he was around 9'6" or 9'9", give or take estimate. So at the end of the day, you can just pick and choose which one you want to believe there, as far as I'm concerned. I do think the 6'6" is suspect because the whole army was scared of Goliath. And even if the whole army was in the low 5-foot range, which you would think there'd be some people who would be taller, like their king, Saul, who was known to be tall. It's hard to imagine some guy who's 6'6" scaring an entire army off. It also talks about his coat of armor was 125 to 150 pounds. I think if you put a vest or armor plating on a 6'6" guy that's 125 pounds, he's going to be encumbered and he's going to be taken out easily because of his slow pace. Because you can't have armor cover your whole person. There's always going to be weak spots. It also says the shaft of his spear's head weighed 12 to 26 pounds. 12 pounds on the end of a stick is massively heavy, and again, it would be a detriment in battle. It would not be helping you here. If you're that big, even if you're on steroids, which they obviously didn't have, it wouldn't work. You may think this is an exaggeration, and you can if you want to, but there have been giant spearheads found that match these descriptions in multiple spots. This YouTube channel is one I recommend. It's called Expedition Bible. He goes on scene to, usually he's not in a building, usually he's out in the Bible lands and looking at different archaeological sites of the Bible. In this video, he's talking about the giant spearheads that were found. The one in his hand, both of these in his hands are giant. The one dwarfs the second one, but even that smaller spearhead is much larger than any normal spearhead we've uncovered that we would call normal. And in this video, if you go and watch it, it's called Archaeological Evidence for Giants in the Bible by Expedition Bible, and I would recommend it. It's only like 10 minutes. He shows regular spearheads in the same museum that have been found in the area, and they're, small because you don't need much to kill a guy. You just need a little knife on the end of a stick. And so these spearheads were huge. And interestingly, they did show signs of use, as if they had been used, and there was multiple in multiple different spots. But, you know, as archaeologists find these things, they write papers about them and study them. Of course, the people who wrote the paper, who studied these, the original people who found this, you know, they're saying, this has got to just be ceremonial, never used. This could not be used by a normal guy. That's completely unrealistic. So, if you want to believe that, you can. But what I'm saying is that this is confirming evidence for the Bible that we have specific for. Okay. There's more verses here that I have that have to do with giants in the Old Testament. And we're just going to, and it talks about how their height is great. I'm just going to skip through these. If you guys want to look at them later, I can give you the slides. And Amos, in Numbers, the word Nephilim is used for the only other time in the Bible. Throughout the conquest areas, it's being used. This one is when David goes back, or his men go back and fight Goliath's brothers, wiping out that land. This one's interesting because there's an Egyptian, which is not an Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim, as far as, you know, he's from Egypt. He's not from that area. And the man of great stature here, great is actually added in the English. In the Hebrew, it does not use great stature. It just uses, he's a man of height, 5 cubits. Now, 5 cubits is huge. It's 7.5 feet. But they don't call him a giant. They don't call him from one of these giant clans, which I find interesting. Now, we do have normal guys, like, for example, in the NBA, who are 7.5 feet. So that's well within reason. I guess now's a good time to bring up, some people, when they think about the giants and they think about Goliath being 9 feet tall or more, they think about the people who have a medical condition called giantism. And that really doesn't line up with the biblical account, because the people with giantism, first of all, there might be the implication there that they are just evil by their presence, which I would not say about those people. Secondly, they have to use like a cane to walk around because they're crippled. And they get injured extremely easily. Their bones break extremely easily. They're weak and thin. And I was going to just show you a picture of some of these people, but they need help standing, and I don't see how they could be having a huge, heavy spear with heavy armor. Okay. Some people like to bring up Matthew 22:30. For in the resurrection, they neither marry, angels, people in the resurrection neither marry or are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. As we saw in the book of Jude, the angels in Genesis 6 were not in heaven. They left their place. So I don't think this verse applies. Angels in heaven is talking about the angels who are following the will of God. They're not talking about fallen angels who are sinning. So no, I don't think angels were created to do this. But we're not created to lie, steal, cheat, murder, and yet we have the ability to do it. And people choose to. So I have that Jude 6 verse that I'm referencing of why I don't think this is a good defense of the mortal view. And I think this is the only thing I talk about here. Okay, good. Now we get to the more interesting part of the slideshow, and I was hoping we'd have more time for this. What does the word God mean? Any brave volunteers? Jacob, we got a brave one here. That is right. But here's the point I want to make with this. So you're too smart for me, but that's a good thing because this was a trick question. So the point I want to make here is that God in English, I'm willing to bet the majority of people here start thinking about attributes. The omnis, all-knowing, everywhere at once, all-intelligent, perfect. I'm guessing thoughts like that went into your head when I asked this question. This is all true of our God, Yahweh. But when we see this word in the Bible, this is not what an Israelite would think. And I'm going to use our remaining time to try to correct this. Here's a good example. Deuteronomy 10:17. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribe. So, is our God the God of the imaginary? No, that's insulting, honestly. These gods are real. But they're not all-knowing, all-present, all of those words that we associate with Yahweh. These gods are something else. They're spiritual beings. How about this verse? Exodus 3:13. Then Moses said to God, if I were to come to the people of Israel and say to them, this is, for context, this is the burning bush story. So Moses is at the burning bush. And Moses says to God in the burning bush, if I were to come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to them, Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say to this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Now, why would Moses have to ask for the name of God if they just called him God? Who sent me? God. That's what we would say. Normal American Western thinking. God has sent me. And Moses here is saying, well, what do I call you? How do I tell people about this? And God doesn't say, hey, call me God. Because that's not how the ancient Israelites thought. That's not how their language worked. The word that normally gets translated to God is Elohim in the Hebrew. It gets translated for the God of Israel, our God, thousands of times. If you're reading through the Hebrew and you see rightfully our God, Yahweh, you'll see the word Elohim thousands of times. But that's not the only time we see the word Elohim. We see the Elohim for members of Yahweh's council in Psalm 82. We see it for the gods and goddesses of other nations, like in that Deuteronomy verse I just posted. We see Elohim used for demons in Deuteronomy 32. We see Elohim used for the deceased Samuel in the story where he comes back with the witch of Endor. And we see Elohim used for angels and the angel of Yahweh. This does not mean polytheism. What this means is Elohim means spiritual being, or member of the spirit world, or maybe there's a better way to pinpoint that. But it's not talking about capital G-O-D. It's not talking about Yahweh every time we read this. And this is something that the ancient Israelite would this is how they think about it. We have to look at the context of the situation to see what's happening here. Question? Yeah. Okay, so for the complete explanation, stay tuned for part 2 of this class, where I'm going to really drill into this. But for a short explanation, there were gods. All of the cultures believed that they had their own gods. And all the cultures believed that their gods were real and the cultures of the other gods were real. But they just didn't worship that God. So when God says here to Moses, the God of your fathers sent me to you, he's saying the God that appeared to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the God who gave those guys specific visions, direction, appeared to them in person, that's who sent you. So right now, and there could be a lot of time spent on this whole situation, because right now, they're out of the promised land. They're in Egypt. They've been here for 400 years. They've been not even established as a nation. And does that answer your question? Okay, we'll get more into this. That's an excellent question, and I was really hoping not to spend so much time on the Nephilim, because from here on it gets a lot more interesting. Okay, Psalm 82. Let's talk about this next week. This is Psalm 82. Okay, so actually, what we're going to mention about Psalm 82 is that, can I have someone read Psalm 89, 5 through, whatever I have up there, 5 through 8. Steve.
Let the heavens praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness in the assembly of the holy ones. For who in the sky can be compared to the Lord? Who among the heavenly beings is like the Lord? A God greatly to be feared in the council of the holy ones, and awesome above all who are around him. O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty as you are, O Lord, your faithfulness all around you.
Thank you, Steve. Psalm 89, the reason I'm having you start there is because Psalm 89 is not very controversial. It's pretty straightforward what's happening in Psalm 89. Psalm 82, on the other hand, we're dipping back into controversy, ladies and gentlemen. Can I have someone read the part of Psalm 82 that I have here? Yeah. Thank you. Good job. What I want to mine out of these verses here is that God has a council of other spiritual beings that he created, that he sits on the top of, and this is how he likes to rule. This is the idea. Let me show you a couple examples of this. But before I do, I want to mention that Psalm 82, why I'm saying this is controversial is because I'm showing you here that the sons of God are angels. But similar to the Sethite view of Genesis chapter 6, thinking that this is all mortal, there's a mortal view of Psalm 82. And the mortal view of Psalm 82 is saying that sons of God here is men, Jewish leaders, and they're doing a bad job. The problem with that is that when he says, you are sons of God, first of all, if this is referring to Jewish leaders, it would be the only time in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that sons of God is referring to men, normal men, and not angels. And that's a problem. The second problem is that, nevertheless, like men, sorry, not that one. he says, you are gods, in verse 6. You are Elohim. As I mentioned earlier, I went through the list of the places we use the word Elohim. It's never mortal men. Not once. So to say, you are spiritual beings, to Jewish leaders, doesn't make any sense. And then to say, you are sons of God, when these are both terms that are used multiple times throughout the Bible for spiritual beings, it doesn't make any sense. The reason I have Psalm 89 up there is because of all the parallels. The divine council in Psalm 82. In Psalm 89, it says the assembly of holy ones. In Psalm 89, with the context of the assembly of holy ones, is heavenly beings, the council of holy men, of holy ones, sorry, not men. They're up in the sky in Psalm 89. See, the problem with Psalm 82 is that it doesn't say they're up in the sky. Now, Jewish Israelite wouldn't have any problem with this. There was no controversy before Augustine about what this was said in the context. They didn't have arguments about this in old Jewish literature. Now, part of the problem is that that idea has came in, and then it gets inserted into John 10:34, because in John 10:34, Jesus Christ quotes Psalm 82, and with 5 minutes left of class, and like 10 more slides to go, should we go into this? You know what? I don't know. Jesus, I'm gonna try to go over this quickly. In John 10:34, in verse, I have the verse underlined there at the top. I and the Father are one. Jesus is saying he's God. He's one with the Father. And what happens? The crowd wants to stone him. Then later on, Jesus is saying, why are you guys surprised about this? I'm paraphrasing. Why are you guys surprised about this? Is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? And then later on, he calls himself God again. Now, if you think Psalm 82 is the mortal view, then you have to think this is a mortal view, and you have to be then thinking that Jesus Christ is saying to his audience, hey, don't you know that your ancestors are gods? Why are you surprised by this? And I don't think that makes sense. But if you take the supernatural view of John 10:34, then it's saying, look, you know that there's other sons of God out there. You know there's a divine council that God meets with them. I'm part of that divine council. In fact, I'm the head of it. And remember that this isn't weird, guys, to have a spiritual being here on earth. You see, Jesus, in many ways, is the antithesis to the Nephilim. The Nephilim are part evil fallen angel and part man. And Jesus Christ is part pure, perfect God and part man. So I could talk about this for a lot longer, but I'm going to move on to the next slide. I want to give you some examples of the divine council to meditate on before we go in the last couple minutes. First example, Book of Job. I think that's a pretty popular story. We have the sons of God coming to present themselves to the Lord. Because this story is so popular, I'll just say, read that again on your own, and we'll move on to the next one. But this is an example of the divine council meeting. Here's another one in 1 Kings 22:19. Now, the background to this story is that there's a king, and it's his time to die. God's decided. We got to get this guy off the earth. Can I have a volunteer read 1 Kings 22:19?
And Micaiah said, therefore hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the
Oh, did I just say that one? Sorry, I meant the whole thing. Oh, sorry. Starting at verse 19. And the Lord said, who will entice Ahab, that he may go up and fall at this place? And one said one thing, and another said the other. Who? Who's saying one thing and who's saying the other? The host of heaven. And then in verse 21, then a spirit came forward. An Elohim came forward and stood before the Lord, saying, I will go out, I will entice him. And the Lord said to him, by what means? And he said, I will go out, and I'll be a lying spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And he said, you are to entice him, and you shall succeed. Go out and do so. And therefore, behold, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these your prophets. The Lord has declared disaster for you. And here we see a template for how the divine council operates. God meets with his council. He has a task. They talk about it. They converse. Somebody comes up with the idea, or a group comes up with the idea. God puts a stamp of approval on. Let's go to the next one. This is the same idea. Kevin, can I have you read it?
And as I looked forward to the place in the ancient days of the sea, his clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flame, and his wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened.
So here we have thrones multiple, and then a court sitting in judgment. I'll go on to the next one. One more. And then I guess we'll call it here. Kevin, can I have you read that one?
The sentence is by the decree of the law, the decision by the word of the Holy One. To the end, the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men.
So here we have again the sentence is by decree of the watchers. That's Daniel's word for the angels. It's also what's used in the book of Enoch. The decision is by the angels. And later on, it says that in this area, it says that it's God's decision. Why? Because they make the decision and God approves it. All right, next week, we'll finish this up and we will talk about a lot more of the gods of the other nations. This week, my text was Genesis chapter 6. Next week, it's Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. And that has a deep connection with what we were talking about today. And we will go over it next week. Sorry if this class felt a little rushed and I still couldn't finish it. I'm still trying to hone my teaching skills, and I appreciate your patience in the matter. Let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this day. Thank you that we can be here to learn about you. Please bless Chris.